evening. Welcome to the September 12th Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. If you can please stand and like to do the Pledge of Allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Can we have roll call, Shannon?
Messina,
Here.
Fleming. Here. Ingalls. Boutrip.
Here.
Mandel. Here. Rumpler.
Here.
Ward.
Here.
Great. We only have two items this evening, administrative item dealing with design standards and a change, and then a public hearing. The applicant is the City of Coeur d'Alene modifying the wireless communication ordinance. We'll get to those in a minute, but besides those two, there isn't many people here in the audience, but I will ask if there's any other public comment for anything beyond what we've got on our agenda for this evening. I take it there isn't. Staff, we've got a few items.
I do. Good evening, Commissioners. I'm going to actually do the rest of my comments from the podium because I have
Okay.
a slide I wanted to show
Sure,
you.
come on up.
Of course, it's the last one I look for. All right. So wanted to announce that this Friday we have our third annual Parking It On Sherman event. This year it's going to be at Sherman Avenue and 19th Street. So we are excited. We have a lot of community participation this year. A lot of partners that are helping make it possible through sponsorships, participation at the event, and also donating items for our raffle. And we are keeping everybody up to date on our city Facebook page. We have an event that was created for this, so there's all the details on there. We will be posting an event schedule soon. And we are also providing some information on some of the activities. So we're going to have a fishing derby, we're going to have a bike rodeo and repair clinic, and we're also going to have a dog parade and costume contest, yes, as well as a photo booth. So those are some of the fun things. There's going to be performances by Sorensen's step dance team, and for Nan Elementary School, they're going to have, some of the students are going to be judges for the dog parade and costume contest. We're involving the schools that way. And then there's some other fun and exciting activities. So we also have an opportunity for people to volunteer. So on this slide on the screen here, you can contact us through the planning department, planningdiv@cdaid.org, or our phone number 769-2274. And thank you. I already have several planning commissioners that have signed up to help out. So thank you for that. We're excited. It should be a great event. Also wanted to let you know that we worked with the Sunrise Rotary and then the Rotary Club of Coeur d'Alene to get a rectangular rapid flashing beacon on Harrison right in front of Bryan Elementary School. Oh. And we did that dedication right before school started, so that was exciting to see that in place. And October meeting, we have several items. There is a request for annexation. We have a request for a planned unit development and subdivision, and then a subdivision and zone change. So those are three separate applicants. So should be a busy month. That's all.
Okay, great. Thanks,
Thank
Sylvia.
you.
Appreciate it. The next item is a administrative item, a request for deviation from the requirements of Chapter 16.15 Design Standards and 16.40 Improvement Standards in the area of city impact. Chris, City Engineer, take it away.
Good afternoon or good evening. Thank you. The subject property is 6160 East Long Shadowy Drive, and though it's not in the city limits, it's within the area of city impact. And I pulled up this map so that you can see exactly where this is in relation to the city. And you can see our green line being city limits. And then over here, this long curvy road is actually Long Shadowy Drive. And the subject property is right over here in the corner of that. It's about 4,500 feet as a crow flies from city limits to that point, but it's still within the area of city impact. As such, county code would require them to build their road in front of their property if subdivided to meet city standards. The property owner wants to divide it into 4 separate lots. It's 12.88 acres total right now, so they're still fairly large lots. Wants to divide it into 4 lots, and as such, he would be required by the county to build the road fronting that to city standards. However, it is, like I said, it's quite a ways away from the actual city, the road that it's on now at Long Shadowy Drive is a gravel road, and it is separated, the property ends right about here, and this is Eastside Highway District's offices here, and it goes through their property there as a gravel road also, and they have no intention of improving that road. Going the other direction, it's quite a ways to get back to Mullen Trail. So the Planning Commission can grant a deviance to allow the developer to subdivide that property into their 4 parcels as a short subdivision without having to build that road up to city standards, which at minimum would probably be 36 feet wide, curb gutter, sidewalk, all of that, but not connecting to anything with Mullen Road being kind of a rural road as the nearest road.
Okay, thank you. Have any questions?
Have we done this in other areas?
I don't know.
I don't remember hearing any of this before.
Yeah, this is my first dealing with an area of city impact so far away from the city.
So it is the county's requirement that they meet the city code?
Correct, because it's within the area of city impact, so that if we were to annex that in the future, it would be built to city standards. But in all likelihood, by the time that got annexed, that road may need to be reconstructed anyway at that point.
So this isn't a city requirement, it's a county requirement.
Correct,
And we can waive that if we want.
correct.
Thank you.
Anybody else? No?
You just need a simple motion?
Simple motion, I guess, yeah.
Seems to me that in the long run, it probably needs to be city standards, but the long run's a long ways from now. You know, that's quite a distance to go. And I'm sure we've all experienced places where we've been out in the country and all of a sudden you hit a paved road and you wonder what in the world is doing there. And maybe it's bases like this. I suspect if we did not approve this, paved by the time the city moved out there, that the road would have to be replaced anyway from just normal wear and tear. So I would move we approve this.
Okay. I have a motion from Commissioner Luper to approve. Do I have a second or any discussion before a second? No discussion. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay. I have a second from Fleming. Do we vote on this or is just, okay, all in favor? Aye. All opposed? No opposed? Motion passes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next is a public hearing. The applicant is City of Coeur d'Alene, a modification to the wireless communication ordinance. Sean?
All right. Thank you, Planning Commission.
You're welcome.
So tonight, before I get started, probably the best way to deal with this is to read some of this into the record. So rather than ad lib, I'm going to read some of this. It's more for the people at home than it is from you guys who've done your due diligence and read your staff report. So give me just a second to relay some of the history and background of why we're taking a look at the wireless facilities ordinance. Okay, so cell phones became wildly affordable and popular in the late 1990s. People started demanding wider coverage. They started using their cell phones for different reasons other than to make phone calls. They've become largely data dependent now. Cell phones, it seems like the last thing you do with a cell phone these days is actually call somebody. You're using it for mapping and for millions of apps and a ton of other reasons. So what the city saw at that time was a huge influx of applications for building permit at that time, and most cities weren't prepared for that. Most cities didn't have wireless ordinances at that time, and the city of Coeur d'Alene was no exception. So, in May of 1997, the city passed Ordinance 2819, which placed a moratorium on future construction of towers until an ordinance could be adopted and put into place. That moratorium was set to expire in August 30th of 1997. Another ordinance was passed, which was 2831 on August 21st, just prior to that expiration date, to extend that moratorium until September 17th, which provided City Council time to take a look at that and get that in front of them. So with Ordinance 2833, which was passed on September 16th of 1997, that put what is currently on our books for the wireless communication facility regulations into place, and they have remained pretty much untouched in those following 20 years. Which is the reason why we're here today. So as far as the background goes, we recently reviewed our existing ordinance, and based upon the fact that the last couple of wireless towers that you guys have approved have had a requirement to provide screening, they had to look like trees, etc. We decided it was probably time to, like Warren Wilson used to say, is make the right thing the easy thing, or define these things up front so that the carriers understand what they're responsible for prior to putting one of these into our city. All right, so the purpose of this article shall be known as the Wireless Communication Facilities Regulations. It's the purpose of these provisions to delineate restrictions, development standards and siting criteria, and establish removal procedures in order to protect the city from the uncontrolled siting of wireless communication facilities in locations that have significant adverse effects and cause irreparable harm. It is further the purpose of these provisions, and then it goes on to cite A through H, and I can kind of touch on them rather than read them all into the record, is to protect the community's visual quality and safety, to do this particularly in and near residential zones, to promote the public health, safety, and welfare, and preserve the aesthetic character of the Coeur d'Alene community, to minimize the impact of wireless communication facilities by establishing standards for siting and screening, to preserve the opportunity for continued growing service for the wireless industry, to accommodate the growing need of demand and for wireless communication services, to establish clear guidelines, as I just recently spoke about, to ensure that the city's zoning regulations are applied consistently with federal and state communications laws, rules, and regulations. Ours falls kind of short of that at the moment, so this will help update that. And to provide regulations that are specifically not intended to and shall not be interpreted or applied to, 1, prohibit or effectively prohibit the provision of wireless services, 2, unreasonably discriminate among the functionally equivalent service providers, or 3, regulate the wireless communication facilities and wireless transmission equipment on the basis of environmental effects of radio frequency emissions to the extent that such emissions comply with the standards established by the FCC. So, at this time, I would like to introduce to you the city's consultant, Bob Dushin. He's the Vice President of River Oaks Communications Corporation. He was hired to take a look at this, as he is an industry expert and does this for numerous cities across the United States. And since he is the expert, I'm going to turn it over to him to define some of these things. He can better explain them in his sleep than I could up here wide awake. So with that, I'll bring up Bob.
Okay.
Sean, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having me here this evening, members of the Planning Commission. My name's Bob Dushin. I'm the VP of River Oaks Communications Corporation. We're based out of Colorado. We've worked very closely with staff on the development of these wireless regulations, and I'd like to thank Hillary and Sean and Mike for their support, and Mike Gridley as well. We've worked very closely as a group. I also want to thank the wireless providers. What we have done is endeavored to get their input on these regulations. We've worked very closely with a number of consultants for Verizon and AT&T. There's a representative here from Verizon tonight. We've worked with her colleagues, and if you have questions for me or for her, I would encourage you to please ask. What I'd like to do is give you an overview of the federal laws. We're not going to get down all the way into the weeds because nobody wants to hear about 332C7 and 253 of the United States Code, but we do need to touch on them because this is complicated. I want to give you an idea of how the federal laws interplay with what's going on at the local level. So if you'll indulge me, I'd like to quickly go through a PowerPoint and then get to the ordinance. What are small cells? That's a matter of interpretation. Lots of times when you talk about small cells, you think about antennas on top of a light pole, for example. What's happened is the industry has moved from having coverage challenges to capacity challenges. As Sean has said, people are using their phones for video, voice, data. Because of that, these networks get to a point where from a capacity standpoint, they need to keep adding equipment so the networks will work seamlessly. That's where the concept of small cells came from. When I started doing this a long time ago in 1996, and I was giving presentations on the Telecom Act of 1996 in the Pacific Northwest, people were concerned about macro towers. What's happened is the industry has moved to small cell technology. Now, I will tell you, there are differences of opinion. What is a small cell? And we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. In one of the proposals, the industry has asked that we define small cells as 28 cubic feet, not including certain equipment. I will tell you that if you Google what does 28 cubic feet amount to, it will start talking about refrigerator-sized pieces of equipment. And I'm not here to talk about horror stories, but I want you to know that there's no one standard for what's a small cell. And so you really need to think about what's going to be on the pole, what's going to be at the top of the pole, hanging from the pole, and what's going to be at the base of the pole, okay? So this involves poles and antennas and transmission equipment. And this does not always include stealth features. You'll see in the ordinance that we've put together, we've really emphasized stealth, especially in the residential zones, within 200 feet of a residential zone and in the downtown core. We've drafted this ordinance so stealth is required in those circumstances. This is an example of something that's not real pretty in terms of a small cell facility. I've got some better pictures that are more favorable to the industry later on, but that's why it's really important when somebody comes in here and says they want to put a 70 to 120 foot pole in your right-of-way, you're going to turn to planning and say, okay, where's that going to go? What's it going to look like? What is the supporting equipment? What do the antennas look like? What do the equipment cabinets look like? Okay, let me tell you just a little bit about myself and our company. We're Colorado-based, as I've said. We've worked in this space, telecom, cable, wireless, in total, when you take all those together, for over 30 years. We've worked in 38 states and Puerto Rico. We've worked in the locale. We helped Spokane put together their wireless communication facilities regulations. We've worked with hundreds of local governments. Current projects involve working on wireless ordinances in Utah, Wyoming, Nebraska, North Dakota, and New Mexico. So what we are able to do is bring a national perspective to this. We want to put in best practices. We've looked at what other communities are doing. We've incorporated those concepts into this ordinance. We're working on projects as far away as Maryland, negotiating with Comcast, for example. So we've had the opportunity to work with cities all over the country over the years. I got my law degree at UVA. You can probably tell I do the legal speak, but more importantly, we do the practical speak. This needs to work for the wireless companies. It needs to work for your community. We are not anti-provider. We are not anti-technology. People want these services. The question is, how do you create a balance between what the infrastructure is going to look like and the services that people have come to rely upon? I've given webinar presentations, and I've actually written articles for a number of municipal leagues around the country as well. Okay, here we go on the overview of federal law. And if this gets too detailed, somebody please stop me, okay? You've got the Cable Acts of 84 and 92. That's a whole separate set of regulations on what you do if you're going to negotiate with your cable provider. You've got the Telecom Act of 96, which opened this up to competition. Basically, here's what it came down to. Congress wanted the phone companies to be in the cable business and the cable business to be in the phone business, to create competition and hopefully to lower prices. You've got, which is not a typo, the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012. Tucked in there is a section on wireless facilities. If somebody wants to come in and make a modification to an existing tower or base station that's not a substantial physical modification, and it involves co-location or replacement or removal of transmission equipment, and Hillary and Sean get an application in, and it fits what's called Section 6409A, and it's a complete application, they've only got 60 days under federal law to say yes or no. And if they don't act on that, there's a deemed granted remedy. And on day 61, the provider can send an email or a letter to the city saying, you didn't act on this, this is deemed granted. You've got 3 different shot clocks under federal law. Well, I'll talk very briefly about that. A 60-day shot clock, there's a 90-day shot clock. If there's a co-location, somebody's going to put equipment on a tower, it's already got equipment there, and it's going to be a substantial modification, you've got 90 days to act. If you don't act in 90 days, there's no deemed granted remedy under that statutory provision, but the providers can then seek other legal or equitable remedies. You've got a 150-day shot clock. If somebody wants to put in a new site or a new tower, okay, and their application's complete, and I'm not going to get into the nuances when the city has to respond to say it's incomplete, and then they've got to respond back, and what happens to tolling on the time frames, but we'd be here for a long time. But the point is, it's 150 days. If staff doesn't act in the 150-day time period on a complete application for a new tower, there's no deemed granted remedy. However, the providers can seek judicial relief. Okay, the FCC came out with a wireless order in 2014. It was over 150 pages long with hundreds of footnotes. It's incredibly complicated. The rules went into effect in 2015, and frankly, what happened with a lot of communities, and I've seen this over the last 2 years, communities said, what are we supposed to do? We've got outdated wireless ordinances, we've got providers who are coming in, they want to deploy the facilities, what are we supposed to do? And that became very perplexing. And that's why I'm here tonight, in that, as Sean said, your current WCF regs go back on the books to 1997, and a lot's happened. And there are, to make this even more complicated, you've got federal proceedings. There's a company named Mobility who's gone around the country, and they've wanted to put in 70 to 120-foot poles in city rights-of-way. Cities have pushed back. Mobility was not happy. There's a proceeding at the FCC right now, basically where the providers are arguing that the cities and local governments are an impediment to the deployment of broadband technology, and cities are asking for too much money. So you've got federal proceedings on top of the existing law. There are about 6 or 7 states in this country that have passed state wireless legislation, not here in Idaho, but in other states. So you've got another layer of state legislation in other states, and then you've got local regulations. And that's why I said at the outset, this really is a complicated endeavor. Okay, I talked about the FCC order. It's long, it's complicated. I would not recommend reading it late at night. It will induce sleep, I believe. Next up, 6409, we talked about that. That's where somebody makes an eligible facilities request. The key is it's got to be on an existing tower or base station. Not just that it's physically there, but somebody came along before and got the permission of the city to put up wireless facilities on it. That makes it an existing facility. Under federal law, here's something I want to make you aware of. What's a tower? It's not what we used to think about. Lattice towers, guide towers. A tower is defined under federal law as any structure that's put up primarily to support wireless or to support communications facilities. So if somebody wants to come in and put a pole in your right-of-way, and it's going to be there primarily to support wireless facilities, that's a tower under federal law. A tower could be a flagpole, it could be just a regular pole that's going to hold these facilities. That's one of the nuances I want to make you aware of. What's a base station? It seems as it would be self-evident, it's not. If you've got a hotel in town, if out at the Hampton Inn, there's a wireless facility on top of that hotel, okay? And the city approved the wireless facility on that hotel, on the rooftop, that is a base station, okay? I know conceptually that doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's the way this works. It's not just the equipment at the base of the pole. So when someone comes in and says they want to put in antennas or small cells or poles, you need to be thinking about all these things. Okay. One thing I do want to mention in addition is that if someone came in and wanted to lease space on a city's water tower, okay, you're acting in a regulatory capacity, not a zoning capacity. I'm sorry, excuse me. You're acting in a proprietary capacity. That's your property. You can take as long as you like to negotiate a lease on a water tower, on a water tank or a water tower. What we're here tonight to talk about is zoning, what you're going to do in a regulatory capacity. And the rules of the game are different. The shot clock does not apply, or shot clocks don't apply if somebody wants to lease space, for example, on a water tower, okay? Let me show you some before and after pictures. These are good examples of how the industry, to its credit, has figured out how to stealth these facilities. There's the light pole before. Look at the top of the light pole now and the base, okay? Before and after, okay? They've done a nice job. Here's a before picture. Now look at the top of the pole, after. That's an antenna, okay? Look at the before and after on the light pole in front of this building, before and after, okay? You've got the antenna at the top, and look how the base of the pole looks just like a part of the pole. There are ways to do this, to stealth these facilities, to make them aesthetically desirable, okay? So now let's talk about your ordinance. First, any questions on the PowerPoint?
Now, there's all this complexity and layers of bureaucracy and rules and everything is so complex, but that was your job to sort that through that and make it simpler for us, resulting in this ordinance that we're considering. And you talked with our city attorney and so forth, and it's consistent with what you've successfully done in other cities?
Yes, it is. Yes, Commissioner, it is. And that was part of our challenge and our charge, to make this work. When somebody comes in and wants to put in wireless facilities, I want them to be able to read this ordinance and understand what it means, and not go into all the legalese that I shared with you on the PowerPoints. I want them to understand what they've got to do to be compliant with your regs, and that way that'll help them make business decisions. What kind of equipment do they want to deploy here? Where are they going to deploy it? And we're going to talk about what we've done procedurally in this ordinance. For DAS and small cells, distributed antenna systems and small cells, as long as there's not a new tower or a new building, and as long as there are not other complexities, that's going to be subject to them getting permits, and it's going to be subject to administrative review. Okay, if they want to put in a tower or a new building, that's going to necessitate a special use permit. Okay, if they want to put in a replacement pole that's not much higher than what's already there, not higher than 15 feet above what's already there, then they don't have to go through a lot of the processes. We're incentivizing the providers to come in here and put in equipment that's smaller, it's more aesthetically desirable, it's going to replace potentially, to Verizon's credit, elsewhere Verizon has been willing to swap out poles and put in other poles that'll handle this equipment. So we're doing this in such a way where there's less process for the providers, and that encourages them to work with cities and communities, because this really is a collegial effort. That's how we view this. It needs to be. This is not going to stop after tonight. You're going to get requests from potentially T-Mobile and other providers, wireless providers who want to come in here, and so we need to provision for that. The capacity needs are only going to increase. People are dropping their landline phones. The cell phones have to handle a lot of data, and so they're going to continue to do this. So to answer your question, yes, we want to make this workable for the city and workable for the providers too.
And workable for T-Mobile and others when they come in.
Exactly, yes. We received comments from AT&T today. I've looked at the comments. We have not had a chance to see which of those comments we can fold into the draft, the latest draft that you all have in front of you. I can tell you that we received a number of comments from Verizon and AT&T's consultants. We've looked at them, we've considered them, and they've had a lot of good ideas. Now, we didn't agree with all their suggestions, but a lot of their comments have been folded into this ordinance, okay? And that's important because we're creating the framework for this to be workable, as I've said. So, and I don't know if you've seen these came in today to planning, September 12th. So I did want to call these to your attention. I'm not going to go through every comment, but I would say that we are going to need to get with staff and talk about which of these are acceptable. If I might just go very quickly through the, or Mr. Chairman, do you have something, or?
No.
Okay, I'm going to go very quickly through the ordinance. As I mentioned, if you flip over to page, I'm going to hit the highlights. If you flip over to page 5, section 4, excuse me, that's where we say, new towers and building.
5,
Yes, page 5, section 4A. New towers and buildings in zones other than manufacturing and light manufacturing require a special use permit. Okay? So what there again, we've said, if somebody wants to put a tower, and other than these two zones, they're going to need an SUP. If you go on down to section 5, we've said 5A, DAS and small cells are allowed in all zones. And then we talk about, and this is what I mentioned a few minutes ago, DAS and small cells are subject to approval via permits and administrative review unless there's a new tower or building. There again, what we're doing is we're saying to the providers, put in the smaller equipment. We want to work with you. If you go over to section 6A, and this is still a point of discussion, we've suggested that each applicant for a tower produce an inventory of its existing towers, not everyone's, but its existing towers and antennas, so it can show the city where it is currently and how that relates to what they want to put in the next time around. I want to show you, if I could, let's see, okay, a map that Sean put together, to his credit. This shows what's going to happen if you have a 1 mile buffer between towers. In other words, they can't put a tower closer than 1 mile next to each other. The industry has asked for a half mile, and the industry has not seen the benefit of the next slide I'm going to show. This was just put together this afternoon, just so you know, okay? Please. But this is what it looks like if you do a half mile, okay? And so that's one of the things we still need to,
A quick question.
yes.
Now, is that the coverage in terms of radio frequency coverage, or just the overlapping? That's just it's just mapping the overlap, the 1 mile versus half mile?
Yeah, that is just the distance
Just the
between
distance, thank you.
towers.
So you can see if this goes down to a half mile, you could have potentially a lot more towers in the city. So again, I understand why the industry is asking for this, but it's something that, we need to further consider and talk about. When it's going to be up to you all in terms of what you want to do on that. Okay, as I go through, and I'm not going to go through every section, but as I go through the ordinance, and you get over to page 10, it talks about the placement of towers. The towers are going to be located in those areas described in Table 1. However, if somebody wants to put a tower in a residential zone or within 200 feet of a residential zone, they're going to have to go through a list of prioritization showing why they couldn't put this tower someplace else. You've got a table here that talks about where stealth is required and where it's not. That's on page 11. It's required in the residential zones and some others. On the first horizontal line, it's required in the downtown core. Stealth is required in the downtown core. And now, if you go to the bottom of page 11, section 9, what we've said is if a tower is going to go in a residential zone or within 200 feet of a residential zone or in the downtown core in an infill district, then there's going to be a prioritization that providers are going to need to go to, and that's on what's the next. That is what is on the next page, 1 to 7. And basically what we're saying, here's the most preferred place to go, number one, city-owned or operated property and facilities that's not in the downtown or infill or residential zones and not including the right-of-way. And then when you get down to number 7, least preferred to put at towers, for example, designated historic districts in the downtown core. So you can see what we're doing. If somebody wants to put something in a residential zone, a tower, they're gonna have to show why, they're gonna have to show with 3 higher sites why they need to go someplace else. And they're also gonna have to show why they should be given an exception. And if you go over to page 14, section 11, and then on to page 15, again, if somebody wants to put a tower in a residential zone or within 200 feet of a residential zone or in the downtown core infill zoning districts, unless this qualifies as a location on city-owned property, they're gonna have to show what they wanna do to fill this gap in coverage, and it's gotta be the least intrusive means to fill that gap in coverage. Long story short, that's legalese, it comes out of a case, right? The gist of it is this, that if somebody wants to put a tower in one of these areas, a residential zone or in 200 feet of a residential zone or downtown or an infill, it's gonna take a lot more work for them to convince people here at the city that's where this ought to go. And we are not, under 332C7, you can't prohibit or effectively prohibit the deployment of personal wireless services. We're not doing that. We're just creating this hierarchy to say the providers work with us and put your equipment in other places. Instead of putting up towers, put up small cells, okay? The last part of this ordinance deals with the 60, the 90, and the 150-day shot clock. No use going into all the particulars on that. The point is, we have updated what we've done is we've taken concepts out of your existing ordinance, your existing regulations, I should say, kept the ones that are still compliant and work within the confines of federal law, and updated this so it becomes workable from a legal standpoint and a practical standpoint and the industry standpoint. That's been the goal. Yes, sir.
I have a question, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, sure.
So maybe if you could kind of step back a bit to maybe a 30,000-foot level here.
Sure.
I'm just curious, so we have, I don't know how many wireless providers there are in the marketplace. Assuming that whether it's the 1 mile buffer or the half-mile buffer, let's assume every wireless provider wants coverage in the Coeur d'Alene community. I'm trying to figure out, just from a strategic standpoint or a competitiveness standpoint, how do we possibly manage or rationally allocate, is there some mechanism, Bob, that you've seen? I mean, if every competitor wants coverage in the marketplace and wants some cell coverage for a complete coverage of the marketplace, how is that possible? I mean, how is that facilitated in a rational way?
Commissioner, that's something we struggle with. I will tell you, that's a real tough one. That's a great question. Here's what I would say. The city encourages providers to co-locate onto other providers' facilities. So if somebody's got a tower and the providers, and I won't speak for Verizon, but my experience is they work with each other. They let, Verizon could go on somebody else's tower and AT&T could go on somebody else's tower. So co-location is encouraged by the city. That's one way to try and handle this. Another thing that I recently read, and I'm not an engineer, so I'm not, this is where I think this is going. Small cells are proprietary. If Verizon wants to put up its small cells, I would think they're going to be Verizon small cells, but there's a movement in the industry for distributed antenna systems to be neutral host systems so that other carriers can use those same facilities. Now, perhaps our colleague from Verizon could speak to that better than I, but that's my quick take on it. It's co-location and trying to figure out a way where providers can share technologies and facilities without having interference problems, and they are competitive with one another. So I wish I could give you a better answer, but those are the two things I see in terms of how to make this happen. We had an internal discussion in our company the other day. What are we going to do, and this is in Utah, when we've got Crown Castle wants to be there, right? And they want to put up their facilities. And what are we going to do when ExtraNet wants to go in and then Verizon wants to come in and AT&T wants to come in? Well, there's just finite space in the rights of way. And so this is I don't think there's a quick answer, but we're trying and the providers are trying to find a way to make it work so they can each deploy their resources. And so that, and the city cannot unreasonably discriminate on behalf of one provider over another. We get it, we're trying to find solutions. That's the best answer I can give you now. The technology may evolve even farther a year from now, and there'll be a simpler, better answer, but right now, you can see it's not an easy one to answer.
Thank you, Bob.
So follow up, it's not as simple as the stringing of your cable TV.
It's not. It is not. And what's happened with cable TV.
Why is that different?
Well, I'll give you my perspective on it. We started helping cities in the cable business in the late 1980s, okay? And because there was really only room, and the cable companies may not say this, but I'll say it diplomatically. Once a cable company ran their wires through a city, okay, it was very difficult for another cable company to come in and run their wires and be competitive. It was just too doggone expensive. I think the difference is, so they basically had the market. And if you go to most cities around this country, you've got one cable provider, fixed wireline provider. You've got Dish and DirecTV, right? But you've got one wireline provider. With wireless technology, there's room for more folks to be competitive in the business.
But my thought was you have a pole, one pole, and it serves many uses.
Yes.
You know, when you threw that up there and following on the previous question Mr. Rumpel raised, it would seem to me that this could be very dangerous, or not dangerous, very disruptive if we have to go down to 1 mile or half-mile ranges and people can put poles up wherever they want to because they want to be competitive. You know, and I certainly support private industry and so forth, but I also support, you know, the public interest. And it would seem to me that if it doesn't exist, it should exist where there is a compatibility, a sharing, so that we don't have a cell tower every 3 blocks because, you know, you got X number of providers.
Right, and your point is very well taken, and I think that's why cities have encouraged co-location and why the providers go for it too, because if they gotta put up a tower and spend a lot of money, it's gonna be a lot less expensive for them to put their antenna on an existing tower than put an entirely new tower up.
So can you require that?
No, there's a case off the East Coast that basically says cities cannot dictate or require technology. We can encourage co-location, we can encourage small cells and DAS, but we can't say to the provider, this is the way you have to build your system. And that's because there's a court case. And that's antithetical to a city's ability to require that sort of thing.
So what you're saying is that if we had 5 different providers, those 5 individual providers each want their own blanket over the locale, that they want to blanket that area and the next one wants his blanket. So we've got these layers of blankets that are providing that service out to everyone. So they're all trying to be on the same piece of real estate with their own coverage. And so we're layering all these same people, so it's a duplicity
Yes.
of service. And it almost self-limits in that it's too many, too much, trying to be all in the same place. That's my thought, is that, you know, you're just trying to layer too many sheets on top of one another.
I think you.
And at some point, we'll have all these, you know, it doesn't matter how pretty you make them, you still got a thing on the bottom of a pole and another thing on top of a pole, and how many of those can you dump on your single environment to provide 5 different providers with the same service? And is that level of service going to be good? And we all know technology changes. My AV guys say, hey, I don't even buy stuff before it's 3 days due because it's changing. So we all hope that this will get smaller, but how do we prevent that from happening when we've got 5 different providers all wanting the same piece of real estate and sticking, you know, co-locating or not? They're sticking on top of building, it just becomes a clutter. And I think that you did require that everyone provide their service for that area. I think we have to have that to know how many of these are occurring in blanket format, so we have a sense for what's coming at us. You know, to not require that of everybody and say, this is Coeur d'Alene and this is where this provider's putting his locates, and then somebody else has, and we can start layering them and going, holy crumbs. You know, we now have Fred Meyer's with 5 different towers stuck on the side of it.
Sure, your points are very well taken. I wish I could give you a good answer. It's, you know, would you like to? Sure, may I defer to?
Yeah, she didn't sign up, or?
I have a real quick question.
Sure.
You hear some of the questions we're asking. The other places you've advised and so forth, do they have the same questions, same issues? And how did they resolve them?
The answer is they're in the midst of trying to resolve them right now. They're doing the same thing you are. They're going through their wireless ordinances. They're updating them, they're modernizing them. In answer to your question, perhaps the representative from Verizon can add some light to this, but I see this, and the answer is, they're struggling with the same thing. In Utah, if we accommodate Crown Castle in this particular city, what are we gonna do when the next provider comes in?
Well, and if one fails, if, say, Crown Castle failed, having put up all these towers and all these smaller locates, they've abandoned that equipment, can that be passed on to somebody else? And that's why we need to have that layer in some record format to say, oh, they're no longer part of this game, and can we really reuse those for other providers?
There is an abandonment clause in this ordinance.
Right.
Which is good, and which it says if they don't use their facilities for 12 months, then they've got to remove them. If they don't, the city can remove them and they'll be charged.
That's why we need a full record.
Right.
Again, we need to have control of that so that when and if somebody jumps out or gets kicked out of the service provider industry, that we know who those are and where they are.
Correct. And in answer to your question, what I would say is, we have all worked diligently on this ordinance together. Don't be surprised if a year from now, Hillary comes to you and says, you know what, we need to tweak this because of the new technology to address exactly what you're saying. I wish there was something we could put in here to address that. My concern is, with what federal law says, we can't unreasonably discriminate among functionally equivalent providers. With that said, cities betwixt and between, but we've done the best we can to try and even with this overlay, to do it in a manageable way. So that's what I would say.
Anything about federal law that says you have to have less than a mile buffer?
No,
Well, that's up our discretion, whether
Yes.
it's a mile or 2 miles, 1/2 mile, okay.
yes, that's up to you.
Do you mind commenting a little bit? And I'd also like to hear from the Verizon representative about that buffer and what the best practices have been in terms of the 1/2 mile or mile, what the trade-offs are, why in Spokane they may have realized that 1/2 mile, and could you comment on that before Verizon does also?
As I said, we helped Spokane put that together. I'm thinking back to why it was I'm trying to think back to why it was a 1/2 mile in Spokane. It's a catch-22. If we talked about this, Sean and the group talked about, if it's less or if it's more, we may wind up with more small cells. Do you remember that conversation, Sean?
Yeah, I do. And so it's one of those where, do you want one large 160-foot
Right.
tower with 5 providers on it, or do you want 120 small cells, running along the edge of the street, sort of thing? And you try and find that balance between the two.
And which one is which? So the mile gives you the large tower?
Big tower, more coverage.
Correct.
Does that answer the question? There's no right or wrong.
Yeah,
There's no right or wrong. And a lot of ordinances don't even have this 1 mile or 1/2 mile provision in it. It just happens that Spokane does, so.
There, if I might, so there may be, I lived in Spokane for many years,
Okay.
and I know that Spokane is trying to differentiate itself from a kind of a highly wired community, a kind of a digital community. And it could very well be that that was part of the consideration, and could even be part of our consideration as well, that to be competitive in a marketplace, to make it a quality of life is now partly digital. I agree that there are some aesthetic issues and some other issues to be considered, but I think for a community to be competitive in the current world as we live in, a highly digital infrastructure makes sense and should be encouraged. Now, whether we can, how do you balance the achieving let's say a world-class digital infrastructure versus some of the issues that I think we've already discussed here in terms of some of the aesthetic issues is an interesting dynamic.
It is. To your question, you could put a mile, you could put 2 miles, you could put 3 miles in here. There's no federal requirement. It's a matter of what you all want to see in terms of the rollout of the infrastructure. If you want fewer towers, put them a mile apart. If you want more towers, half mile. But the question is, if somebody's going to drive by a tower, and to your point, with lots of providers up on it, are you better off having 3 or 4 what we've done in this ordinance, we've said, and if you go up higher, we'll let you go higher if you'll co-locate, if you let somebody else go on the tower. So what we've tried to do is give the providers flexibility where they can add height to their tower as long as they let somebody else co-locate. My thought, and it's up to you all, was have fewer towers with more people co-locating on them, so you don't have as many macro towers all over the city. That was my thought. Now, maybe that's my preference. It may not be your preference. But that was the thought process on it. Fewer big structures. And also, for example, if somebody wants to go in the industrial zones, let them go in there with an administrative review process, okay? Let them, that way they'll go to the industrial zones rather than a residential zone. So again, we're trying to incentivize the providers to put these where people are less likely to say, hey, well, you all don't get a call, hopefully, saying, what's this tower going up? We're trying to do this with fewer towers and put them in places where they're less noticeable.
If I can step in just for a second and
ahead,
remind
Sean.
Commission of the last time we approved a tower. It's not shown on this map yet because the permit hasn't been approved yet. But they had originally come forward with a request for a 60-foot tall tower, and staff had worked with the applicant to request a 70-foot tall tower to allow additional co-locate.
I make a comment on this. There's a lot of information here and a lot of red marks and changes and stuff. And summary on this, I guess my feeling is it comes down to the distance, half mile, mile, how high or short they might be, whether they're on rooftops or not. I'm not quite sure how that works out, but I think those are the few items. All the other stuff that's in here that's, want to change and stuff, it's all for the better of the city. And we're talking the city of Coeur d'Alene, and I have a question to you, Bob. Since you've been here, have you talked to the county, Post Falls, Hayden, any other areas? They have to have, I would imagine, some requests for towers every once in a while. What's their outlook on this, and if there was any communication between City of Coeur d'Alene staff with any other jurisdictions out there regarding, are they changing anything, or are we the only one addressing this issue?
Could I take just a quick
So
run at
whoever
that?
wants to answer. So,
I was just with Warren over in Post Falls, and
Okay.
The city attorney, and Warren is tracking what you're doing here in Coeur d'Alene, okay? So his ordinance looks a lot like your ordinance, and what he would like to see, because he views this, I'm not speaking for him, but because essentially this is one big market, right? And so what he wants to do is make sure that his regs in Post Falls mirror what you all are doing here. So seamlessly, the providers can do what they need to do, between Post Falls and here. I can't speak to the county or Hayden, but.
Commissioners, I did meet with the county as well as Verizon. So Verizon wanted to meet with both jurisdictions just to talk about small cell technology, to make sure that we were thinking about incorporating changes into the ordinances to allow small cell. We are doing a lot more than I think the county will. The county is going to make some changes, but not to the extent that the city is in terms of stealth requirements and all of that. But they are going to be addressing the small cell technology. I don't know in terms of their buffer, if they have that outlined in their ordinance or not.
And we're perhaps a little more aggressive because we have a smaller footprint of our city in our square miles compared to the county. That there are more and more people, given the population, are going out further and further. We're kind of bottled in here. So I certainly understand the need to change this. I'm sure we'll perhaps have some more comments from the commissioners, but Bob, I appreciate. You continued, I'm not saying you should be done, but appreciate all the information you've given us at this point in time. I don't know if we have any more questions, Mike?
I do, actually. I kind of want to think back to Chris Bosley's presentation earlier, and of course, the area of city impact. So would that area of city impact, the planning and/or the potential incorporation of that area into the city? Because maybe not that area in the near future, but there are other areas of city impact. Is this ordinance taken into that consideration, meaning if you were to place a tower in the county within the city area of city impact? Does that make sense what I'm trying to ask? I want to make sure
Is it
that.
that in our mileage radius or?
And the agreement that the city has with the county for our area of city impact only addresses the street and the road standards at this time. It's possible, we've talked with the county and the other jurisdictions, that it may be time to all look at opening up the area of city impact agreements again and the maps and kind of showing where do all of the cities think they're really realistically going to be growing.
Because
And so at
ultimately,
that time,
that might
it
be a
could
good
be
time to
addressed.
capture this idea and also have an ordinance or have a language such that it could, because the last thing you want to do is live in the city limits thinking what's across the street is county, but then all of a sudden there's a 100-foot tower right there.
A little bit with Fernan, because there was a request, Mobility was looking at putting a tower in Fernan immediately adjacent to our city limits, which would impact the city. So that is something that,
Okay.
we can at least have those discussions with the other jurisdictions, even though it's not specifically in our ACI agreements, but just to say, hey, we do have these requirements for the co-location and the stealth. And so to try and get each other to kind of,
Because we're still in a draft mode in essence, correct?
We are.
Yeah, so that's why I made that
and the one-
question/comment about that.
And to your point, one of the things we put in this ordinance, we've said each applicant for a tower, and I'm going to paraphrase, is going to provide an inventory of its existing towers and antennas, et cetera, that are either within the jurisdiction of the city or within 1 mile of the border thereof. So we've tried to future cast this.
Okay.
Mike, you?
Yeah, Chairman, I just want to add, I apologize for getting here a little bit late, but one of the things that precipitated this effort by Bob and planning was a company called Mobility came to us with a proposal asking for an encroachment permit. Was this discussed earlier? Last year for a 160-foot tower. And they were going to put several 160-foot towers in our right-of-way. And they felt like they were allowed to do that by right and wanted to come in. Huge bases, huge poles, and so before that horse got out of the barn and down the road and got anywhere near approval, we decided that maybe it's time to bring our ordinances into the modern age and at least have an opportunity to protect the community or do what the community wants with this technology. And so we did not think that having these 160-foot towers was a good thing for the community. Doing something else that provides technology and provides all the data and everything we all use every day, we're all about that. So we're trying, using Bob, who is obviously very active and familiar with the industry, looking what other jurisdictions, San Diego, some of the places that have really looked at, you have 20 million people with cell phones. There's antennas all over the place, and they've done a good job of disguising them and doing things. So we're trying to get ahead a little bit. That's one of the criticisms of government is, well, why didn't you guys, think about this or do something about it before it happens? And so that's kind of what we're doing. We're not trying to limit the industry, and Bob has done a great job working with them, so as planning staff has. So that's a little bit of background of why we're doing this.
Mike, it's always comforting to hear you comment on things, because you think things very well through. Thank you.
So, this ordinance, like any other ordinance, whether it's a building ordinance or not, it's a, I guess, a guide for an applicant who wants to put a tower up to say, this is what you have to do. And if they want to do anything out of this, then they would have to go through, I take it, what would they have to do if they say, well, we want to put one closer, and they come before us, as they have in the past, or the staff work it out? What would be the process if someone said, we need to do something different than this ordinance would be?
I think in this draft ordinance, we've really tried to address all those different nuances to, like Bob had talked about, kind of we're trying to create ways to incentivize them to do certain things, which is our preferred, and that's the easiest for them, administrative review or just building permit or encroachment permit versus a special use permit. If they can't meet any of those requirements, there's always the chance they can come in and talk to us, and they could come before the commission. It may trigger another amendment to the ordinance.
Okay.
There's a special use permit process where you all would look at a number of the categories to see if they are entitled to a special use permit, and they can come in and ask for an exception. But there again, it's, the answer to your question is they have to go through a lot more process.
Right.
They've got a roadmap here where if they want to put something in the city, and speed to market is a very big deal to these providers. So if they want to come in and get their facilities deployed, there's an easy way and there's a more complicated way. And they're going to hopefully have the good sense to say, let's do this, working with the city and do this because it's good for them and it's good for the city.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions for Bob before we have our next person come up? Come on up.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Just state your name for the record and perhaps your address. That'll be
Yes,
fine.
my name is Leela Vaga, and I'm here representing Verizon. I'm a Seattle resident. I live at 208 Northwest 48th Street, Seattle, Washington.
I just want to say you're in favor of this, and you do want to speak, so go
I
right
do,
ahead.
indeed. So I think it would help to give you a bit of an overview about how wireless technology works. This is a very complicated topic and a very technical subject, and well, actually, first, my prepared comments were a thank you to staff and to your consultant for taking this on, and I think that it's wonderful that you've hired a subject matter expert to help you with this, because there's a lot to navigate through. And the ordinance, as it is drafted, as we've seen in the last draft, really is a wonderful ordinance from our perspective. As Bob said, didn't take all of our comments, but the prioritization in the hierarchy really helps us understand what this particular community prioritizes and wants, and we do try to cite with that. Let me start with just how wireless works a little bit. So each of the carriers leases different portions of the spectrum, so different wavelengths of frequency from the FCC. So what that means is that our signals propagate with different characteristics. So, and it varies based on region, based on company, so it gets very complex. But essentially, one carrier's signal might carry a lot of data a shorter distance, whereas another carrier's signal might carry, less data but a wider distance. And you can also adjust that with how you configure your site. So when you're talking about the blanket of coverage, it's not the same frequencies, it's different frequencies layered on each other. So to give you an idea of the challenge we're facing. So by 2019, wireless data traffic is expected to be 7 times what it was in 2015. And that's because people are using their devices differently now. So people are using them for video streaming. It used to be people were just using their devices when they're out and about. Then they'd go home and they had their home set up, with their cable and their home phone line. Now what we're finding is people are, especially remote workforce people, are using heavy amounts of wireless data in the home, and that use is really becoming something that we're seeing across the entire community rather than just focused in these core areas. Another challenge we have is that if you put too many macro sites close together, you get interference, especially if they're tall. So if you've got macro sites, the old model was you would put macro sites on hilltops. And those things would go for miles because they didn't have to carry a lot of data. So they could carry small amounts of data over that wide geographic area. And one method that we have to accommodate capacity, and our primary method up to this point prior to the small cell deployments, has been to put in more macro sites at a lower height and tilt those antennas down. So when you're thinking about the half mile versus 1 mile, keep in mind that one way that we can meet our capacity needs is to put more towers in at a shorter height and direct them. And that gets us part of the way there. It's never going to get us all the way there, because no matter how densely you put your macro sites together, you're going to get to a point where, from an RF engineering standpoint, your signal from one macro site runs into the signal from another macro site. And that causes interference and is not workable from a RF perspective. So that's where small cells are really valuable, because small cells have a range of between 400 and 1,000 feet for the antenna. So not miles, but, blocks. So that signal literally is not powerful enough to travel to the macro site and provide interference. So you can have a layer of small cells literally underneath the macro site, adding capacity. I wanted to specifically address your comment about the various layers of coverage and what if somebody goes away. With the growth in data that we are expecting in the industry, that capacity is still going to be needed. So imagine, one of our competitors just suddenly disappeared. Those users are not going to disappear. Those users are still going to be using that data. So they're still going to need that, we're still going to need that data capacity to exist. And I think I've touched on the major questions you asked, maybe a little too quickly, so please feel free to add.
So what are the co-location possibilities for small cell technology? I mean, for the macro sites, it seems like we've heard about that, kind of layering on top of the poles and adding height. For small cell, is it possible to do co-location in creative ways?
It's a lot of the same conditions. And actually, I'm glad you asked that because it reminded me of the DAS system point as well. So with macro site co-location, sometimes it's feasible to co-locate on another macro site, sometimes it isn't. And that's because our current macro sites are configured in a different way, but also because our signals travel different lengths. So I appreciate the way that the code is currently drafted has that as a siting hierarchy, and where we need to technically show that it's not feasible to co-locate before we do other solutions. Sometimes it is not technically feasible because of the way the signals propagate and where our particular gap in coverage or capacity is. The same is essentially true of small cells, but with small cells, you're trying to keep them small. So the question then becomes, do you want to have, a small cell grow into something larger with more antennas on it, or do you want it to stay a single carrier kind of smaller antenna? Also, I'd say that not only between carriers, but also within carriers, different kinds of equipment are deployed for different kinds of needs in the network. So whereas picture LA or Boston where we've got big downtown high-rise buildings, there it might make sense to go with smaller equipment, but much more frequent, because we're not trying to go through the big buildings. We're trying to get into nooks and crannies. Whereas if we're going into more of a suburban residential neighborhood, that's where we'd probably want like a 2-foot panel antenna with a larger radio associated with it, because then we're trying to get up the front yard and into the house with our signal, and that particular antenna needs to travel farther. So it comes down to the same basic considerations when you're talking about small cell co-location in terms of just how big, versus, do you want to go bigger or not? Also with small cells and with macro sites to a large degree now, higher heights are not always desirable. Macro sites heights are set by our RF engineering team, and they vary depending on what our other macro sites are in the area and the topography. Small cells, our target at Verizon for small cell height is somewhere between 20 and 45 feet. And if you go higher than that, because these antennas are such low power and have such low range, you actually start to lose range on those antennas. DAS systems. Neutral host DAS systems, we're currently deploying them more in venue kind of environments. And even in those environments, we often have different antennas for the different providers because of the different frequencies that we propagate on. So, for example, thinking of like Safeco Field or CenturyLink Field, we've got DAS systems in those places, but we don't always co-locate on the same antenna. We have the same infrastructure, and then we go back to equipment rooms that have our different components that break it up into our transport. So even those neutral host systems aren't always the same equipment. And there are antennas that can propagate on a wide range of the frequencies, but they're not developed to a point where it would make sense for those for something like a small cell deployment yet. So in other words, at state of industry right now, we can co-locate on each other's towers and infrastructure, but we put our own equipment there most of the time. And that's just where the technology in the industry is at this moment.
I have a question. You've got the antenna, just as an example, you have that lamp post, you put the antenna on, you put the base unit on the bottom. Are you at a point where, because I've seen it, the underground terminal that's a box underneath the ground that serves a number of antennas, are you there yet? I've seen it in Europe, I've used it in the Middle East because we had sandstorms. Question is, do you have anything like that on the market yet, where we have fewer of these things on our already cluttered sidewalks? We have sculpture, it's kind
yeah.
of competing with the sculptures.
So vaulting equipment exists. It does not work at all well in anywhere that gets any significant amount of rainfall based on our current.
Oh, well, we have snow. That's
Right,
even
yeah,
better.
it's a
Okay,
challenge. It's a
okay.
big challenge. It has been done.
Yeah.
Every instance I've personally seen of it has had lots of maintenance problems.
Okay.
But when you're talking about equipment, so a macro site, you have your antennas up at the top, and then you have ground equipment space where you have your radios, and then you also have what, to simplify, I'll call computer servers, baseband units, zipper units, computers. On a small cell installation, at the node level detail, at least as Verizon's deploying them, you've got your antennas and your radios, and then that's connected by fiber optic cable back to an existing macro site or other base facility, and so that's where the computers are. So Verizon's current proposals for small cell installations usually do not include ground pedestal cabinets. We usually include antennas and radios on the pole or in the base of the pole, and then the computer units are elsewhere. The only reasons why we would deploy in cabinets aside is if it's the preference of the jurisdiction that we avoid the large base and instead have a separate cabinet. That's, or if it's a requirement of the utility provider, for example, that we would have our meter not located on the same pole as our service. I'm trying to think of any other examples where we would choose to do that. Oh, if we were to deploy battery backup, which Verizon is not currently proposing in any of its Pacific Northwest small cell installations.
I'm just worried about 5 flavors. 5 flavors of lampposts. Everybody's got a different base unit. Everybody's got a different antenna. It's
Yeah.
just visual chaos.
Yeah.
That worries me a lot. I'm really into controlling that visual impact. And
It's something that's
if everyone
actively
could
evolving.
uniformly use the same base unit, the same antenna, at least then there's consistency. But if it's 5 flavors, woohoo, I can see a real mess.
Right now, it is 5 flavors.
Yeah, I know. I've seen it.
Another thing I want to point out, the pictures were great illustrations of what small cell technology is now. That first one, the utility pole, I'm pretty sure I actually took that picture of one of our facilities. I wanted to explain some of the advantages of utility poles versus disadvantages of utility poles. When we co-locate on a utility pole, stealthing the cabling becomes much more challenging, because we have to comply with the National Electric Safety Code standards. And so, or National Electric Code standards, depending on, who owns the pole. But that requires that we have our conduit standing off from the pole, that it limits how we can stealth, just the fact that you can't put things in the pole is a limiting factor in terms of stealthing. However, it does prevent us from needing to put new structures in. So we're going on existing structures rather than propagating a bunch of new structures. And where utilities are already overhead, it's often the least intrusive means to put attachments on existing poles rather than running down to the ground and going up to new poles. So something to keep in mind with that. Light standards are much easier to hide things in, just by their nature, that they can be hollow poles that you can run things inside.
Go ahead.
A few questions. Do you have an advocacy for the half-mile or 1-mile buffer? Is there a position that Verizon has on that?
Half mile is definitely preferable because it gives us more tools to be able to put in those smaller towers that would absorb that capacity. Generally, we're in favor of anything that leaves our options open to address the situation based on RF need and the specific circumstances of the project, rather than a blanket designation. And anecdotally, I can say that we have run into challenges with jurisdictions where we have that 1-mile separation, because that tower that's within 1 mile is not necessarily sited where we need it for our coverage gap. I do think that can be addressed in other ways. And Bob's point about, the more small cells, if you've got the 1 mile buffer versus the half-mile buffer, is an accurate one. We will have to come up with other more creative solutions and different solutions if a tower is what is, from an RF perspective, the most appropriate solution, but it's not available to us because of an imposed radius. So our recommendation would be that as the ordinance currently is written, does a lovely job of like citing priorities, but having a path with more extensive review for cases that do not meet that priority
Just one other quick question.
Go ahead, Lou.
Yeah, so are there any technology trends that we should be mindful of? So is there a kind of a limitation to an antenna size or radio size, or is there a trend towards miniaturization of this technology that might obviate some of the kind of issues that we've discussed in terms of aesthetics?
The trend is towards more data use across the board and towards more RF frequencies that allow for higher data capacity. And what that means is that those signals do not travel as far, and that has to do with, if you want a signal that carries a high amount of data, it's going to be a higher frequency, which does not travel as far, but carries more data that shorter distance. And we are going to be using all the tools in our toolkit to keep up with the demand that we're expecting to see in the wireless
I guess
industry.
what I was getting to is there a limit to is there going to be always a footprint, a large footprint, to enable whatever frequency you're trying to transmit, in terms of either the size of the antenna or the size of the radio, or can that stuff be miniaturized based on the different radio frequencies that are going to be used?
We've seen some shrinking of equipment size, but I would not count on a lot of shrinking of equipment size in developing a code. And should that happen, I think it would be good to revisit. But at this point, what we're seeing is really more that the usage increase, the small cells in themselves are a much smaller deployment, but our macro sites are going to continue to be the backbone of our coverage network. Our macro sites are still going to be how your phone has signal in the event of a power outage for a 911 call, that kind of thing. The small cells are really more of a capacity infill solution. They can, in limited instances, be used to provide coverage into targeted places where we, for one reason or another, do not have coverage now. But what you're going to see from Verizon, at least, is going to be both macro sites and small cells working together to meet the need.
Real quick question. You talk about light standards, using existing poles. Any other creative options out there that you're aware of? I mean, rumors I've heard are like utilizing traffic signal, those big, huge arching traffic poles that are pretty big size to begin with. I'm sure on the inside they're hollow.
Yeah, traffic poles can be a great solution. In my mind, I loop those in with light standards. One challenge you have is that they're very large for a reason. There's often a lot of stuff inside them already. Most often, we do have to replace light poles when we install small cells on them. And that's not because they are currently not structurally supportive of the wireless equipment. Often, that pole could hold the weight just fine, but it doesn't have the interior configuration for the cabling. Or it's a foundation design issue. But most often, we end up replacing the poles. As far as creative solutions go, there are a million different ideas out there, and the industry is just really starting to evolve in terms of small cell stealthing. So, one idea that I'm happy I personally came up with was, can we make this look like a transformer on the utility poles? And we can. That answer is yes, we can. Then it's just the question of, do you want 2 or 3 transformers on a pole versus the wood box? These are complicated aesthetic principles, and most that I've seen have come down to different ways to shroud or paint or camouflage the equipment. I've seen a film from 3M that you can wrap your equipment in that is supposed to make it look like the background, like it's basically a reflective film. That sometimes works well for some instances, not so well for others. I've seen a cactus that looks really great, a saguaro cactus. But of course not very applicable for this particular region. So ultimately, you've got your antennas and you've got your radios, and they need to attach to something. The radios the antennas need to be about 25 to 40 feet in the air for a small cell, or 60 to 120 feet-ish for a macro, for rough ranges. And then what you do to camouflage them or dress them up is, as long as it's done with RF transparent material, does add cost to the project. It does add complexity to the project, but, other than that, it's really, limited only by the integrity of the materials and imagination. The basic equipment, though, basic equipment of antennas and radios, that they're still antennas and radios. And they vary in shape and size to some degree, but that actual technology, I would recommend you plan for what exists now.
Quick question on that point. Given the coverage that we have for Coeur d'Alene, and I know you can only speak for Verizon, where do you see Coeur d'Alene right now as far as our coverage, and maybe Bob can address this too later, our coverage now, and are we going to get inundated with requests for more cell towers in the next year, 5 years? And I understand it's not just phone calls nowadays, it's everything else that I think every kid in the world or here in Coeur d'Alene are on the phone 24/7 doing whatever they do on the phone. So it's that data, I believe, that's driving, I guess, the need for either towers, big, small, or whatever. So what's your feel for Coeur d'Alene in the next, whatever time period you're comfortable with?
Okay, let me first say, I cannot specifically comment on specific proposed Verizon projects because my headquarters team really frowns on me putting things into the public record that are proprietary information.
I appreciate that. Thank
So,
you.
but generally speaking, I can tell you that the reason we requested that initial meeting with the city and county is because we do have our first small cell project we would like to pursue within the city of Coeur d'Alene. We are in our node identification stage for that, where we're initially starting research on where we would like to put these nodes, looking at the pole owners and approaching pole owners about, would you be willing to allow us to co-locate on your assets? And the reason why we engaged the city at that point is because we know this is new and we want you to be aware. It is not just our kids on videos that is causing this wireless use to go through the roof. Smart city initiatives, everybody talks about smart, like self-driving cars. That is something that's coming, but it's more things like, your smart thermostat in your house, your refrigerator that runs on a little wireless connection. It's your, I today have, my personal phone and my work phone and my work tablet, and at home I've got my Chromebook, and the average American household now has 13 connected wireless devices. It is also people just using the technology more in their life. So again, more anecdotal examples, but I think that you've all probably seen similar things. My husband now watches TV on the Chromebook in bed instead of watching TV on the couch in the living room. We are using our devices differently. And recently I heard the cell phone referred to as the remote control for your life. And that's really what it's becoming for us now. And that's going to continue, coupled with things like wearables and smart traffic lights and smart trash cans with a sensor in them that tell you when the garbage is full, so that the services aren't wasted. These things all require wireless data, and that trend of increasing adoption of those kinds of devices is not expected to slow anytime soon.
Okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate that insight.
What about, and Bob, maybe you would be the one to answer this question, I'm not sure, but anyway, what future demands do you see being placed on public safety services? Because, you're starting to see the dissemination of information via text from larger agencies, if there were catastrophic event.
More than 70% of 911 calls are coming from wireless devices
Right, so
these days.
therefore.
And also wireless, or emergency services use mobile data. They are heavy customers of ours because, that when the police stop somebody and runs a background check from their car, they're using wireless data services to do that. So in that way, it's very important. Also, Verizon actively is involved in fire emergency efforts and other COW emergency wireless deployments to facilitate emergency provider communication in the event of natural disasters and other emergencies. Just as the rest of the world is going more wireless, so are our emergency services.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for commenting on that because I think a lot of the bias is that it's just for consumer, just for consumption, individual consumption, entertainment. And I think for us as a community, our digital infrastructure has a lot more than just consumer orientation, but also economic competitiveness, attracting businesses, the advent of things like artificial intelligence and big data being used for healthcare and emergency. So in terms of the future of Coeur d'Alene, I think it's beyond just the individual consumer.
Well, as we speak, we're live, I guess, or whatever it is that we just started
We're
here.
live streaming on Facebook right now.
So, we're a perfect
Using
example
that
of why we need
Should've
more.
told my husband.
But, thank you. Any other questions? I appreciate your time and your insight on all this stuff. It's complicated but interesting. Thank you. Thanks. Before I close public comment, Bob, do you have anything else you want to address before we go into discussion? We're good?
I did have one, just.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so there was some comment for the record from AT&T. And I was just wondering, Bob, have you had a chance to review these comments, and are they acceptable, a challenge? What should we do with these?
I did have a chance to review them,
yeah.
and some are acceptable, some are not.
Okay.
And so it's a matter of us working with staff to go through the comments, figure out which ones are going to work, which ones don't. And so that's where we are in answer to your question on that.
Anything else, Bob? We're good? Okay, I'm going to close public comment at this point, and I guess I'm going to either open it for discussion or go to do we need a simple motion on this, or what's the simple motion again?
That would work fine, yep.
All right, so if we have more discussion, and then we can have perhaps a motion on it, whatever you like to do.
What is the matter before us?
Excuse me?
What is the matter before us? We have an ordinance.
Mm-hmm.
We have a consultant commented on it. We had our city attorney comment on it. We had some letters that came in that were recommending some changes that the city has not really addressed yet. So
I'm
what
not
are you
sure
looking-
about that.
What are
We'll
you
ask
looking
them.
at?
Yeah, is this ready for adoption? I guess that's your
That's sort
getting
of
to.
what I'm saying.
This will go with a recommendation from Planning Commission on to City Council for the final decision. And so it's like any other ordinance, there can be some slight tweaks as it goes forward to City Council, or if there's big tweaks, if you want it to come back before the Planning
And
Commission.
is that based on the red line markups of the
The
corrected?
red line markups one, those are the comments
Those
that
are
came in from Verizon and AT&T.
And where
The
are you
clean-
at on those?
Bob already incorporated a majority of those into the draft that you have with the date at the bottom that was September 6th.
So then it's just revisiting this
So it's just those few
basically,
items that came in today. Those are the only ones that we have yet to
And a half mile
address.
versus a mile.
Correct.
So
Where's the half mile versus a mile? It
Isn't here yet.
is
no,
not in
that's
here.
kind of what
Oh.
our recommendation would be, depending on what we choose, half mile,
Mile.
yeah.
One of those.
So our decision-making tonight and our recommendation would be what we choose to recommend, a mile, half mile, move this forward so that staff, if I'm understanding this, will work on it a little bit more, and then it'll go on to city council. Is that right, Hillary?
That is correct. And if
Okay.
you wanted something in between, I think the industry standards probably is more in the half mile or 2 mile increments, but we discussed it internally. I don't know how it would work for Verizon, but even like a 3/4 mile, I mean, split the difference. It does still open up new areas, but it doesn't open up as much. So there's different things to
So
consider.
what we have in front of us with these red indications on here, is this the final draft that city council is going to see? If we say go ahead and we recommend what we see in front of us to go forward to city council?
The versions with the red lines is not the final one that Bob did. The clean version that's at the beginning of your packet, that's the clean one that would go forward to council with a few small
It's
tweaks.
the ordinance, basically, that we're seeing titled ordinance.
Right, but there are attachments that are ordinance with red lines from
Yeah.
the wireless providers with their comments.
Right, but we don't need to look at that theoretically. those
No,
have been
theoretically you
folded in.
don't, and we probably won't provide that on to council. It'd probably provide more confusion. We'd want to have just kind of clean document going forward to city council.
You see past,
Okay, hold on, Pete's got something, Mike, go ahead.
So we've addressed all the comments we received and incorporated in the ordinance, with the exception of what Mr. Rumper lifted up here.
That's
So
correct,
how
as well
is this
as
gonna
the
be
spacing.
incorporated in there?
That's something that we are going to work with Bob and staff and kind of work on which ones we think were going to
So we're
work
gonna
with us
ask
or not.
Bob tonight what we should do with this one.
We could do that, but like I said, we can still work on the ordinance before it goes forward to city council, if you're comfortable with that. You don't have to address every item this evening.
Great, confidence in us and Bob and everybody, but it even better feeling when Mr. Gridley and you look at it and put your stamp of approval and nod on it before we make our final approval.
Okay. Mike, you had something, you done, Pete? You good?
Well, one other thing,
Go ahead.
do we specifically address tonight half mile versus mile?
Well, I have a
Okay.
comment. As my review of the
yeah,
document, it looks like half mile. I mean, I'm seeing a half mile pretty much in the red line version. It is 1/2 mile.
The
I
red
see it
line
in
is from the
section.
The
carrier.
red line is not our version.
Oh, this is not the,
carrier.
We've got the 1 mile version.
that wasn't
right now.
adopted.
And that's what I'm trying to, I'm
Got it.
trying to make
The
a
red
point
line
here.
is from one of
Following-
the,
You had a question? Go ahead.
Actually, a comment, I just want to make sure, I'm looking at, I believe it says page 1, updated 9/6 of 17, ordinance number blank, and ordinance amending Article 8. 8? Yeah, 8. Wireless communications facilities, blah, 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 whereas. That's the ordinance that is in front of us to make the motion on, correct?
yes, the one that's clean, no red lines, no comments in the margins, and it has updated 9/6/17 in the footnote. That's the
Updated
one.
9/6/17, and that's 6, 7, how many pages is this?
19.
19, okay.
So that's what we're considering this evening.
I see, there we go.
Yes, 19
Okay.
pages.
We all on the
And
kind
in
of the
this,
same page on that one?
Literally and figuratively.
Yes.
rip out all the rest and.
And how this,
So I guess the question is, or comment that I had made earlier about the area of city impact, that's not in this.
The 1 mile outside of the city limits, Bob mentioned
You
that that
feel
is
that that's
addressed in here.
adequate to address that type of concern?
Bob, come on up to the podium for you.
Because I think it's important that for future
You're right.
issues, we,
Commissioner, let me ask Hillary, your thoughts on that? We've got it in that one section where it talks about they've got to do an inventory of their own facilities in the city and 1 mile beyond. Do you think there's something else that you would like to see added to that?
Is 1 mile enough?
Well, I think especially if we already have, depending on what our buffer is, I think 1 mile is sufficient. We also can't really, I mean, we can ask the wireless providers to show a map of their facilities outside of the city limits, but we can't do anything with the ACI without the county agreeing to it. So we can't put anything in our ordinance that
Oh, I see.
requires
Okay.
the county to do anything. That would have to be a separate discussion with the county and a separate agreement.
handshake.
But I think it's appropriate how we have, that they would have to map showing 1 mile outside of
so
city
you feel it's
limits.
sufficient to address, again, that style of concern?
I do, and I think Bob had included that because that is kind of the industry standard.
I think that's the right approach. As Hillary said, we can't compel the county to do something. So by having the providers give us this inventory that even goes a mile beyond the city limits, I think that's a real good step.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other discussion?
let me see if I
Question? Go ahead,
understand,
Pete.
if I understand.
Understand.
just we-
Go ahead. Sure.
The city has hired a consultant
Correct.
who has done things like this in other areas. The start of this was some things became before the city that just were not compatible with the city's desire of the aspects and visual impact and so forth. So the city said, we need to do something to upgrade our ordinance to be more modern and corresponding to changes in the industry. Hire the consultant worked with the city, and then we put out to some of the providers and let them comment on it.
Okay.
They made those comments, then it all was incorporated into, with the exception of this one item right here, was all incorporated into what we have before us.
The ordinance that's in front of us, yes.
So the cities drove it, the consultant drove it, and we had providers there, so we have some type of agreement of the three.
Okay.
We've talked about the visual aspects and so forth. We're not changing the 1 mile rule right now, are we?
Unless someone proposes it.
Not, there's.
If the commission wants to suggest a half
Right,
mile
we
or
can if we
three-quarter
want to,
mile.
but
Yeah,
right now,
but if we
what we're
no
talking,
suggest, it stays right there.
I think that's
what we are
discussing.
talking about is 1 mile.
Yeah,
Right.
that's the
Okay.
issue, I think.
Go ahead.
As, what is the current standard?
Right.
Well, based on what my interpretation of what we did here, I think it's a pretty good product.
Okay. Any other
Chairman.
comment on this? Lou?
Chairman,
So, it seems that the industry bias is for the half mile. Spokane adopted a half mile radius. And there was some language that suggested, I think at least in the A&T comments, was that if co-location is not feasible, that the half mile radius be applicable. I think that was one of the things they suggested here, which is similar to Spokane's ordinance. I certainly would feel comfortable in trying to encourage and enable the most highly digital wired community as we could have, assuming that this ordinance helps shape the behavior of the various different providers, and that Bob has laid out a rubric that's as acceptable in industry standard and best practices. I guess, Bob, maybe you could just give us your last word on the half-mile argument, and then,
Can I add
my
one-
bias for the moment is for the half-mile, but I'd be
Can
certainly.
I add one comment before we go further? Because, first off, I'll acknowledge that this is a lot of stuff to throw at you guys. I mean, it's complicated stuff. I don't understand it all. That's why we have reached out to experts in the industry on this and reached out to the industry. So I apologize a little bit about, all this coming to you in kind of a short version, trying to digest it. One recommendation, I suppose, the Planning Commission could express the issues that have been brought to you, the comments, and acknowledge that those are issues to be discussed further or to negotiate further, and direct staff and Bob to work through that with the industry to kind of come up with a resolution. I don't know if we have enough information to really boil it down to a recommendation on a half mile or a mile tonight, but the recommendation to work through that, given that there may be merits for half or a mile that we just need to sort through with the industry. Oh, that would be one out here, I think, is that then we could take it to the next step with staff having done their best, Bob having done their best, and the industry done their best. So.
Thanks, Mike. Go ahead, Bob.
And I want to address the question you asked me earlier. 2 years ago, we did Spokane in November. That's when it got passed. And I cannot, I don't remember the rationale for the half mile. It's something we could check on with Spokane, because I want to be able to answer your question. But I just, standing here, having worked on that several years ago, I want to be able to answer your question directly. And I don't think I can do that unless I talk to Spokane. So.
It seems to be an important factor that probably won't be resolved tonight, but I could see based on the industry comments and the explanation from the Verizon representative that, we don't want to set it up just to be the path of least resistance, just so it's easier for industry, but we also don't want to be so regimented that it's a mile without any true rationale from a technology and feasibility perspective. So it'd be nice to come up with a balance, I think, where we're considering the density and encouraging, incentivizing co-location, and but still opening for creative solutions depending on the capacity requirements from the community that we're at least amenable to a shorter radius or buffer, but with some conditions, and I don't know what those should be. So I like your recommendation of
And the
pursuing
community is not just, as you had said, consumers only. We're talking the law and public safety.
Right.
Those sectors that also have huge demands, the hospitals and such. So, yeah, there's a great need for it.
I have a
Need
quick
to
question.
provide it
And
for
I
the
flagged
future.
it last night as noise. Do the small antennas put out a low hum? The large ones I know do. They put out do we have a hum?
So Verizon's proposed small cells, as they're currently designed, are passively cooled, which means basically they've got no cooling fans or
No
or other
fans.
cooling things in them. So they do not to produce
It's
an
not an
audible
audible
hum.
hum.
There are small cell installations that I've seen that do have cooling fans, especially in warmer climates. and then they would have a small noise associated with them, but nothing like what you would hear from a macro site with a
Which
HVAC
has
system
that
and a
hum.
generator.
Right.
It's not along those lines. Also, that's something that might vary depending on whether a battery backup kind of system were being deployed. Again, Verizon is not proposing battery backup on small cells, but that is a component of the technology.
So that helps with a half-mile deal. If you've got a lot of them, you're not setting up a hum throughout the whole city that's kind of,
Okay,
Mr. Chairman,
go ahead,
It
Pete.
sounded like the city attorney had an idea how we can move forward on this by reverting something back to the staff on I'd certainly like to entertain that if he wants to reiterate it, because it seems to me that would get us going.
It's up to this panel to figure out what you
Well,
want
no,
to do.
Well, your suggestion, Mike,
That's what he-
was,
Well, I think recognizing,
direct
you know,
the,
staff's
staff to
recommendation based on all the efforts that have been put in primarily by planning and with Bob's help, is that we go forward with this
adopt
legislation,
it. I
this
think
piece. That's the
that's correct.
recommendation or the decision before you. Now, you've made comments, you've recognized that there have been comments brought to you that you think have validity and should be explored further with staff and the other folks, the industry. We can take that recommendation and act further, incorporate it, and then take it to council for the next step. It'll get another scrubbing. You know, I don't hear anything, and again, this is a lot of stuff to throw at anybody, but don't hear anything from you that says, oh gosh, you know, this is absolutely not right, we won't do it. And again, staff has put a lot of time and effort into this.
so we go forward with this, and then we have additional data on a mile versus half mile, and we can make that decision later.
We want the city
Take the
council.
city- okay.
council.
That
Okay,
direct the
I feel
staff
comfortable
to
with that.
continue to.
I think
Well,
that-
why don't we try this? Why don't we see if there's a motion?
yeah.
If someone wants to make it, and then we'll see what happens after that. So,
I'll make a motion.
all right ahead.
This ordinance brought before us September 12th, 2017, for an amending Article 8, Wireless Communication Facilities Regulation 17.808.800-17.08.830 of the City Code of the City of Coeur d'Alene, providing definitions, providing for permitted locations, providing for permits, providing for severability, providing for repealer, and providing for an effective date. This therefore covers Article 8, Wireless Communication Facilities Regulations, covering those regulations that I just noted, and that following federal laws, coming into compliance with federal laws, which I think was a big driver on this one, regulations and court decisions, wireless technology as it currently stands, and consumer usage, which is growing exponentially, have reshaped the environment within which wireless communication facilities are permitted and regulated. And then it goes on, and I think we have made our thoughts known. I think we need to go forward with this, and I think we ought to leave it as it stands and not debate the half mile versus mile. I think we're going to punt on that part. But otherwise, I think it's an excellent sort of round out of what we need, so.
Okay, great. I have a motion by Fleming, and looking for a second.
I'll second that motion.
Okay, any discussion before I call for a call? None? And is a roll call or just all right, all in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Being all in favor, I'd say that the legislative item 0-5-17, modification to the wireless communication ordinance, has been recommended to go forward to City Council as it was presented this evening to this commission, and from staff and from the participants and our council person that helped us do this, and from the information given from Verizon. Thank you. Anything else before I ask for adjournment? Motion to adjourn? Somebody?
So move.
Second?
I'll second that.
Thank you.
Before we vote, I'd like to say, Thomas, it's very